Hello everyone, and welcome to the supplemental lecture on Stuart Hall's The West and the Rest. This is quite a good text to read, not just for this week's topic, but because it provides good introductory background that many of the texts that we're going to read later in the term are going to refer back to. Stuart Hall will do his breakdown of these theoretical concepts, and I will in this lecture do my breakdown of his breakdown, and hopefully that'll help you a bit, not just to understand this particular work, but some of the works that we're going to be looking at later in the course. So the title of this chapter, this is a chapter in a longer work, is The West and the Rest, and this is one of these phrases that will pop up again and again and again in this course. It's quite a popular phrase. If someone is critical of the emphasis placed on the West, the phrase The West and the Rest gets across the idea that in a lot of sociology, a lot of political science, a lot of theory, there is a great deal of attention and concern placed on the West, and then the remainder of the world can often be treated as a kind of an afterthought, an undifferentiated rest. And so Hall is playing with that in this title. You'll also see people who don't like this critique, who also pick up on the phrase West and the Rest, and they use it ironically or they scramble it around in order to try to defend the position that actually the West just is more important, and we'll read some texts coming from that point of view later in the term as well. One of the other works that you might want to take a look at if you're interested in this general theme, but that's not something that we assigned for the course, is Woolf's Europe and the People Without History. And again, it's a similar sort of concept that there is a tendency to look at the remainder of the world as though it is a static, timeless, pre-modern period, rather than something that is as active and dynamic and has the same kind of history and the same kind of diversity as we're used to thinking of in the core. Stuart Hall's going to spend a lot of time in this particular piece, not just on his subject matter, okay, so he provides historical summaries of the sort of basic milestones in the rise of the West and in European expansion, but he's also going to spend a lot of time in this text talking about theoretical fundamentals, and the things that he's talking about in summarizing are things that are going to come up again and again in the course, so this is a useful article for beginning to get your head around those things. He raises these terms discourse and power. Now, these are major categories of political and social theory. Power is an older category, but has gone through several different stages in what people understood it to mean. So you've always had a concept of power in the sense of powerful people. You'd have kings or aristocrats, people who possess some sort of special ability. You might have priests. You get over time a growing emphasis on institutions that hold power, particularly around the formation of absolutist and then nation-states and bureaucratic institutions. And these are identifiable, locatable places where you can talk about power residing and people possessing power and power being exercised by law. More recently, you've had a great deal of interest and emphasis, theoretically, on more decentralized forms of coercion and influence, forms of power that are not so easy to locate in a particular person or set of people, forms of power that are not so easy to explain in terms of institutions, but seem to sort of float around, seem to have an impact, people seem to be constrained by them, but they're not easy to locate in terms of older notions of where power resides. You might hear this expressed as a power of culture or of shared norms or of everyday practices, ways that we exert influence on each other where it's not entirely clear who's doing the influencing. Okay, so the concept of power has shifted over time, not to deny that there are powerful people or powerful institutions, but to encompass these additional concepts. And the notion of a discourse is referring to that more decentered understanding of power. So you hear the term discourse, and in everyday language you think, well, that's about speech. The concept of discourse as used in social and political theory is wider than that, but to understand why a term that normally refers to speech has come to be used to talk about these decentered forms of power, you need to take a little bit of a detour back to take a look at the work of someone named Ferdinand de Saussure, When you look at the reading list for this course, sometimes it can look like we read absolutely everybody of any potential significance theoretically, but actually we're leaving out a lot of people. And Saussure is one of these major figures. He's a linguist whose works have had enormous influence on particular types of political and social theory, but we're not reading him directly, although we'll be reading a lot of people that are referring back to his works. So when he's thinking about language, he's trying to think about how we can conceptualize language as a social practice, and language is an unusual kind of social practice. It's not like a law or like a custom where we might be able to point to its origins, or we might be able to tell you something about who enforces it. Although we have people who keep dictionaries and we have people who run around creating grammars, language is something that we pick up in the first instance in a more decentralized, informal way in the course of our everyday practice. It is not something that is given to us in a very localized way, and this is something that interests Saussure. Language isn't designed. There's not a set of people who sat down and said, okay, this is how we're going to speak. In recent history, people have tried to create languages, but the languages that we have from birth are not these sort of creative languages. They just sort of emerged. And this concept occupies sort of the space for those of you with a biology background of a notion of natural selection. It is a very complex process, it generates very complex results, but it doesn't do so in a way that, according to the theory, can be pinned down to a particular designer or set of designers. It's something that happens because of the impact of lots of organisms on lots of other organisms. Saussure conceptualizes the development of language and the functioning of language in a similar way. So language for Saussure operates as a mutually referential system of signs. He's interested in getting away from what he regards as an older conception of language, where you've got a world of words that refer either accurately or inaccurately to a world of things that is separate from the words. He emphasizes the way in which individual words only gain their meaning and only make sense within a mutually referential system of other kinds of words. And this is a set of concepts that recent political and social theorists often find quite useful for thinking about power relations when it's not the kind of power that is imposed by a law or forced by the brutality of individual people. They're forms of coercion that seem to exist. We can tell that they seem to exist because people don't behave in completely random and unpredictable ways, but there's no clear, identifiable institutional or personal force that's making those patterns in our behavior happen. You'll hear a term post-structuralism, and post-structuralism refers to the forms of social and political theory that pick up on these structuralist concepts of language and try to work with them when they're analyzing social practices. So Stuart Hall is talking about this theoretical space, and he's going to apply this theoretical space to the concept of the West and the rest, and he's interested in our ideas of the West, in these sort of tacit associations that we have when the term comes up, and how it tends to prime us to think about our social world, our globe, our global relations in a particular way, without anyone insisting that this is how we have to think. These are concepts that float around and that tend to prime us to think of things and react to things in particular ways, and he's interested in how that happens. So where the chapter starts is he says, what sort of category is the West? It sounds like it should be geographic. Okay, it sounds like it should be a part of the world. It's a directional category. But he says the way we actually use it is much more complicated than that. We don't use it primarily, and certainly not exclusively, to refer to a bit of the map. We use it to refer as a shorthand to a type of society, to a level of social or historical development. When we think about it as a geographic category, it looks kind of incoherent. So some parts of the world that you'd think, looking at a map, fall in the West, he talks specifically about Eastern Europe, are often not included in what people mean when they say the term the West. Whereas some locations that are well distant on the map, like the United States or Australia, are often mentally included when we refer to the concept of the West. Okay, so he says that how do we make sense of this? It sounds like a geographic category, but when you look at how we use it in quite different ways. He says you have to think of it not as a geographic category, but as a historical one. It is a concept, he says, not a place. And then he wants to look at how the concept arose and what the effects of that concept are. Okay, so he's not asking, is the concept correct? He wants to know what it does, what it tends to channel us and prime us to think. Now there's a distinction that runs through his text here, and this is one of these other things that's going to come up again and again in the readings that we do this term. So there's a term, functionalism, and you'll sometimes see people describing themselves as functionalists, and you'll sometimes see other people very critical of the concept of functionalism as though it's something that no decent thinker would ever do. And some of that difference boils down to the fact that there are two different things that are running around that are sometimes called functionalism. The unproblematic kind of functionalism is when someone decides, and Stuart Hall's going to do this here, to analyze the function that something performs. There's a theorist that he's drawing on heavily, Michel Foucault, whom we'll meet next week in the course, who also frequently analyzes what are the functions that something performs. And this is just one of the many ways that you can look at objects and analyze them. There is a more problematic kind of functionalism that is quite important in classical social theoretic texts, and again we'll run into some of that next week and as we go on through the course. And this is a form of analysis that argues not just that you can analyze how things function, but that says that you can explain why something arose by looking at the function it performs. And this is a sort of category error that again you'll often see in some kinds of misrepresentations of accounts of natural selection. Okay, where natural selection can certainly enable you to talk about the functions things serve, but there's no way that you can use the function that something will eventually serve to explain why it evolved. This is like a social theoretic version of that argument. And the sort of more fancy phrase you'll often see when people are critical of this is that the argument is teleological. If something is teleological, it means that you are thinking that a long historical process can be explained, that you can understand the cause of that process if you understand the end point of that process. So it's as though the end result of a long historical process is actually explainable by that end result itself. Another phrase for this in some other kinds of writing would be backward causation. Okay, as though where something ends up somehow had a causal influence on things that are much historically earlier than when it actually happened. So Hall is actually criticizing a teleological understanding of the rise of the West. He doesn't think history's been pointing toward the West. He doesn't think that history is trying to generate this particular end result. He doesn't think this end result was inevitable. He doesn't think the fact that it happened lets you explain anything about earlier human history. He thinks it's contingent. He thinks it's accidental. History didn't have to go this way. But he's still interested in understanding the functions the concept performs. So once we have this concept, once it's on the historical register, it has an impact, and he's interested in that impact. He lists 4 functions for the concept of the West. He said we use it to classify, is a society Western or is it not? It forms certain images for us, certain associations. When we hear the concept of the West, when we hear the term, there are things that pop into mind kind of involuntarily, and so it helps us get a sort of visual or visceral sense of what we're talking about. He says that it's used as a standard or a model. Okay, if you're trying to work out an ideal toward which certain kinds of societies might trend, or if you're trying to criticize certain societies, use the concept of the West can be used that way. And it has frequently functioned as a criteria for ranking societies. Over the course of the term, we'll look at a number of approaches to the theory of development that rank societies or rank countries based on the assumption that there is a developmental continuum from less developed to more developed, and the concept of the West often sits on the more developed end of that continuum. So that's one of the functions that Hall analyzes. And he says that by playing these functions, the concept has an impact regardless of where it came from in the first place. Then he talks about the role of the rest, the other parts of the world. He says the concept of the West implies that it's sort of a self-contained European thing. But in reality, if you look at the history, and he'll spend in the next several pages of the chapter doing this, what you find is that the development of the concept of the West is integrally tied all the way through to interactions between the West and the rest of the world. So he spends some time here, which I won't go into in detail in this lecture, but which are relatively easy to read and worth reading, on a historical summary of the European expansion and an analysis of the impact of that expansion on ideas of the West, where he talks specifically about the growing internal cohesion of the West. Now, this is a bit problematic because this is an area that will also be engaged in hideous wars with itself for large portions of the period he's analyzing, but there is a level of rising cultural mutual reference that's going on as well. And then the ability of the concept of the West to differentiate itself out in contrast to the New World and to the world of non-Christian societies. Okay, so that section of the chapter you can take a look at for more detail. Then he moves back from the historical summary back into the issue of the kind of social theory that he's using. And he makes a contrast between the terms of discourse and ideology. A discourse, he says, is something that is produced by lots of different people in many different institutions. So as we said before, it is decentralized, it is not intentional, but it's coherent. It makes a certain amount of sense, things fit together, you get a feel for a discourse. And one of the things you can think about as you go forward in this term is about the discourses that characterize, for example, political discussion in Australian society. You probably have a feel for what sorts of positions tend to go together, and yet if you were to back up and sort of look at those positions from Mars, it might not really be clear why they were grouped. So there are things that someone might think or might tend to think if they vote Greens or if they vote Liberals, that don't necessarily hang together by their logical coherence, but hang together by their historical coherence. They'd arisen in lots of different places, they seem to stick together and be coherent. There's not somebody designing this, produced by lots of different people, but you get a discourse as a sort of way that they all hang together. And he says that a discourse constructs positions from the standpoint of that discourse. So this is one of the things that for social and political theorists who use this concept makes the concept kind of hang together. And I'll read a little quote here. For example, we may not ourselves believe in the natural superiority of the West, but if we use the discourse of the West and the rest, we will necessarily find ourselves speaking from a position that holds that the West is a superior civilization. So using the terms of a discourse, even if you are a critic, even if you disagree with that discourse, using the terms of the discourse implies a particular set of associations. It primes you to think about the world in a particular way. And therefore, talking about discourses becomes extremely important to particular kinds of social movements, to feminist critique, to post-colonial critiques, talking about the ways in which the very language that we use, the very terms of the discussion, already tend to prime us to think about issues in a certain way. And it's one of the reasons why cultural contestation and the contestation over language and over terms comes to be very, very important to social movements over time. And we'll talk about this and revisit it again and again in the course. Discourses, Hall says, are not closed systems. So you don't have just one discourse for a particular society. You've got lots of them. And they interact with each other in complex ways, and they can also be internally complicated. So they're not monolithic, they're not homogeneous, but the elements that are combined in them sort of make sense in a state-of-the-art kind of way, in a feel for the field of play, that you have a sense of if you're a participant in these discourses. He contrasts the idea of a discourse to the concept of ideology, and ideology is something, again, that we use a lot in popular discussions, and you'd have a feel of that from the popular use of it, that the concept of ideology for most people tends to imply that you've got fake ideologies, okay, they're sort of false representations of things, and then you've got the true things. So implicitly you can see through an ideology from some standpoint or another, and the ideology can be perceived as a false overlay or a distorting overlay onto reality. Now, I'll break a little bit here from Hall's text to say that there are lots of people who would not agree with this concept of ideology, and who have concepts of ideology that are much closer to Hall's concept of discourse. So when you run into someone later in the course using the term ideology, it's worth trying to spend a couple seconds wondering, are they one of the people who think that, you've got true reality that the researcher or the theorist has access to, and other people are ideological in ways the theorist is going to criticize, or are they people who are using ideology, much like Hall is using discourse, where the idea is that we all participate in discourses, you're not outside them. We all participate in ideologies, you're not outside them. These are different ways that theorists can approach these terms, but Hall's drawing this distinction here. And then he refers to Michel Foucault, who's someone that we'll meet in the course next week. Actually, we do have a piece of his this week as well. He refers to a specific concept of power and knowledge. And for those of you who looked at the Bacon text from this week, this is a concept with a very long genealogy that Foucault will pick up on and spin in a very particular way. But Hall says, although the concept of discourse sidesteps the problem of truth, falsehood in ideology, it does not evade the issue of power. Indeed, it gives considerable weight to questions of power, since it is power, rather than the facts about reality, which makes things true. This is the kind of statement that serves as an absolute red rag to a bull for people who don't like this kind of theory. What does it mean to sidestep the problems of truth and falsehood? What does it mean to say power makes things true? Many people are very, very disturbed by this. Many people also find it very, very compelling. And it's a theme that we'll revisit repeatedly through the term, because often the fault lines of a theoretical debate hinge on statements like this. Okay? With many people wanting to configure themselves as the representatives of truth, becoming very, very angry at theoretical positions that act as though the distinction between truth and falsehood is not the relevant distinction for their analysis. And both sides of this debate have a tendency to misconstrue, to misrepresent the best possible position that the other side could put forward. So keep an eye on this as we go forward. Part of the debate over this particular issue, over discourse and its contrast with ideology, and whether discourse needs a concept of truth or falsehood, hinges on whether a particular form of theory is relativist. And this is a debate that is not just going on in academic circles, it spills over into policy circles and into public political discourse. It's something that you will find people fighting about in newspapers if you read these sorts of articles, and it is something that has actual effect on very concrete things like what governments fund, and particularly what they fund at universities. So Hall has said discourse shifts analysis from questions of truth and falsehood to questions of power and knowledge, and if you don't already know, you'll learn as the term goes on just how enraging some people find this kind of statement. And the perspective that finds it enraging says, how do you make judgments? If you bracket questions of truth and falsehood, how are you deciding what to do, what's right, what's wrong? What do you mean by talking about power and knowledge? Does this just mean whoever's the strongest wins? How does this defend society from brutal and inhumane forces? And this is not a divide between the left and the right. There are people on both the left and the right that fall on either side of this particular divide. So it's a very, very interesting kind of debate that tends to get a very strong visceral reaction from different people. So when you say that you're shifting from questions of truth and falsehood, it sounds relativistic. It sounds like how would you make judgments, that someone's trying to sort of float around above the realm of judgment as though they are themselves outside of what they're describing. And yet, that can't quite be right, because the theorists who are using this kind of discourse analysis tend to understand themselves as critical theorists. They are using it because, like Hall, they don't agree with what the discourse says. But what's the standpoint from which they can make that claim? Okay, so if you're bracketing questions of truth and falsehood, and yet you're sort of saying you don't agree, agreement seems to require truth and falsehood as concepts. I agree with something, I've got reasons for that, presumably. What's the standpoint? How can you explain, can this kind of theory explain the basis for its own truth claims? And we'll revisit this again and again and again. So there are responses to these critiques. But what you have are critics, and we'll meet some of them this week and later on in the term. Habermas and Nussbaum are two of the prominent ones, but there are lots of them, who argue that this particular kind of theory, the theory that heavily sort of references Foucault and refers to these concepts of power and knowledge, involves what Habermas calls a performative contradiction. So a performative contradiction is when you are engaging in two different practices that contradict each other. And Habermas says that just by dint of making an argument, by participating in a discussion, by putting forward your analysis, you are participating in a game about truth. You are putting forward reasons, you are trying to persuade other people, and you cannot do that, Habermas thinks, and say that you're bracketing questions in truth and falsehood. You're not bracketing them, you're just not being explicit about them. That's one line of argument, and again, there are responses to those criticisms, but I won't go through the whole thing here. We'll read lots of that over the term. And then there are other critics, and this tends to be a more popular sort of public intellectual or political governmental discussion, that assume that this kind of move to saying that you're going to bracket questions of truth and knowledge and that there's a relationship between power and knowledge, they assume this move is necessarily relativist. So they take the claims in a very straightforward way, very much at face value. And oftentimes you'll hear it being accused of being nihilist. Nihilist is this, sort of long-standing term that you apply to people that you think are undermining the fabric of civilization, that are sort of doing away with our morality and our ability to make sound judgments and take moral actions. And this has real impact. So this sounds like a very abstract, very philosophical discussion that would just be going on at coffee shops around the university, but this particular issue is the thing that has played out in Australia and in other countries in things that are wars of various sorts, cultural wars, so science wars, history wars, culture wars, that have to do with real contestations, often with real money and real laws behind them, over what's appropriate for social movements to do and to demand, for intellectuals to say and to write, what's the function of universities, and what's the function of a variety of other institutions, including governments. So it's a strangely practical, impactful discussion for something that sounds so abstract. Okay, so after that somewhat dense theoretical discussion, and it's well worth reading because it will come up again and again, and Hall is at least trying to break it down for you. The more times you read somebody trying to break it down, the easier it will be to get a hold of it in the end. He moves on and he talks about the problem of representing the other. And he talks specifically about Said's Orientalism, which is a work that you'll have the opportunity to read some excerpts from later in the term. And he talks about the discourse concerning the other. And this phrase, the other, will often pop up. It's often used to refer to anyone that we're exoticizing. Okay, so someone that is not regarded as part of our familiar in-group, not regarded like us. They're an other. We see them more abstractly. We see them in a more stereotyped fashion. And Said's Orientalism talks about Western views of the Eastern other. Okay, I won't go into great detail on this section, both because we'll be reading Said later and because I think it's something that is parsable. It's something that you can work through if you sit down and read it yourself. But to summarize roughly what Hall is after, he's talking about the exoticizing gaze. Okay, the term the gaze, how we look at other societies, is also a common reference point, a common word used in a lot of different theoretical approaches. So we look out at an other that is not familiar to us. It is harder for us to see them in detail, and we exoticize them. We render them even more alien and foreign than we might do if we were able to see them in concrete detail, in their complexity and nuance and contradiction. Okay, but we represent other societies in an exoticizing way. We other them. Sometimes theorists turn it into a verb. And this exoticization can be expressed in negative stereotypes. Okay, we're all very sensitive to that. We're all aware of it. But it can also be expressed in what superficially seem to be positive generalizations. These are often romantic or nostalgic, and we ran into some of this in readings like the Montaigne earlier this week. So when we tend to look out on other societies and say, oh, they're much more innocent than we are, they are simpler, they are gentler, they are innocent of the complexities of that complicate life in Western societies. This is just as generalizing from Hall's point of view and from Said's point of view. It's a failure to recognize the other in concrete, contradictory, nuanced terms that we more readily apply to societies that are more familiar to us. Both are problematic for Hall. And then he addresses something, and this becomes quite important too, and we'll see the argument that he's addressing popping up in text as we go through the term. So there are people who say, sure, Montaigne, racist stereotypes. This was all something that people did back then. We've grown out of it. We don't do this anymore. And there will be people who will argue this, and we'll read their arguments for it as we go forward in the term. Hall says stereotyped thinking about the rest isn't just something we used to do. It's not something that we've outgrown. And then he runs through several of the founding figures of sociology whose ideas are still quite influential, Marx and Weber. And he says these ideas are baked in. They are part of what modern sociology is. And we can't say that we're past this. This is something we still need to grapple with. And it is his argument for why we still need to theorize it. So he says, in transformed and reworked forms, this discourse continues to inflect the language of the West, its image of itself and others, its sense of us and them, its practices and relations of power toward the rest. It is especially important for the languages of racial inferiority and ethnic superiority, which still operate so powerfully across the globe today. So far from being a formation of the past and of only historical interest, the discourse of the West and the rest is alive and well in the modern world, and one of the surprising places where its effects can still be seen is in the language, theoretical models, and hidden assumptions of modern sociology itself. Okay? So think about this as you go forward in the term, and as we read, as we will later in the term, analyses that argue that we have a clash of civilizations, or discussions about the changing configuration of the global economy. Are we at a point where we're moving past these assumptions? Are we not? It's something worth thinking about as we go through the term.